Oke, halo, selamat malam. Jadi, hari ini kita akan lanjutkan pembahasan mengenai reading session kali ini mengenai buku Luiz Pessoa, yang ini adalah The Entangled Brain, ya, jadi Entangled Brain. Kita masuk ke chapter 3, ya, The Minimal Brain, Building Simple Defenses and Seeking Rewards. Oke, ada beberapa section dari bab ini. Ada two small hills on the road. Decision, shoring up defenses, seeking out rewards, neurotransmitters, short detour, internal context signal, am I injured? Then extending the circuit. Oke, kita baca lebih dalam lagi. With a system as complex as the brain, where should we start describing it? In this chapter, we describe the idea of hypothetical minimal brain that allows an animal to defend itself and seek rewards. Essential components of survival. How do sensations lead to action through simple sensory motor circuits? We'll see that action flexibility necessitates uncoupling sensory and motor components. In fact, a brain can be thought of as an entire circuit in between sensory and motor cells. This solution frees animal from acting simply based on sensory or motor sensory stimulation. Instead, a multitude of factors that encompass emotional and motivational variables are integrated with perception and action to allow a successful navigation of the environment. Kunci dari chapter ini ada di bagian sini. We describe the idea of a hypothetical minimal brain. Kemungkinan besar di dalam chapter ini akan membahas banyak hal evolutionary, tentang evolusi dari hewan yang memiliki respon terhadap lingkungan. Apakah itu merupakan sudah mulai dari brain sisi awalnya? Seperti itu. Oke, kita lanjutkan ya. You are reading this book now, either on paper or on a high-resolution screen. By engaging an incredibly complex visual system, an imaging device, perhaps a new generation magnetic resonance imaging machine, trained on your brain would reveal a large array of visual areas. Among many others, they participate in a fine orchestration that takes years to master. Think back to elementary school. Now, look around you. Primates, including us, are used in this IMAX spectral view of detail and color. In primates, when researchers poll the various pieces, the visual cortex adds up to roughly a third of entire cortex. In the 1880s, experiments with both dogs and monkeys point to that occipital cortex as an important territory for vision. In the subsequent decades, the systematic study of clinical cases of patients with blindness, incomplete or one side of visual field led to the localization of the visual cortex in the occipital cortex in humans too. 100 years after Hermann described his findings about vision in dogs and monkeys, David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel would be awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in 1981 for their work on the visual properties of neurons in parts of the thalamus and several cortical areas. The centerpiece of the work was the description how cells in the primary visual cortex generate their responses, allowing the visual system to respond to contours and boundaries, the basic building blocks of perceiving the shape of objects. Ini introduksi, masih awalan, jadi Awalan pendekatannya dimulai dari fungsi okupital korteks antara hewan dengan manusia, kemudian pendekatannya visual system boundaries, salah satu karakter untuk itu. Humans who have lesion in this part of the brain are blind, with the extent of the blindness depending on how much context is compromised. Puzzlingly, this is not what George Ritter, a temporary medical officer in the British Army, observed when he examined World War One combatants. Ritter reported his findings in an article published in 1917 where he described how soldiers who had been blinded by gunshot wounds that had destroyed the visual cortex around the calcarean fissure could still see motion in their blind fields, so not much else. A fissure, also called sulcus, is a groove or in the cortex. The portion in the cortex is called gyrus. Ini ada sedikit bahasan, sedikit anatomi yang belum terlalu dijelaskan detail di part sebelumnya, di section 2. Ada namanya sulcus, ada yang namanya gyrus. Sulcus itu adalah bagian lekukan mendalam, sedangkan gyrus adalah lekukan yang memiliki permukaan besar kayak gundukan gitu ya kalau gyrus. Oke. The findings reported by Ritter and few others lie dormant for many decades, most likely because they countered the prevailing view that occipital cortex was necessary for vision. In 1973, another study reported on the effects of gunshot wounds to the occipital cortex in the back of the head. This time, other scientists paid more attention. The patients investigated admit to no visual experience in the part of the visual field affected by the lesion to them. They were blind there, yet they could move their eyes towards small visual targets presented in the blind part of space if brought enough by experimentalists. Admittedly, performance was poor, but statistical analysis suggested that it was better than random guessing. How could the patient accomplish this if they didn't see the targets? Okay, the primary admitted no visual experience. They were blinded, yet they could move their eyes towards small visual targets. Oh, okay. Performance analysis suggested is better than guessing. It If it crossed your minds that the patient had gained some from extrasensory perception following the tragic incidents, this is not what's going on. It turns out that there was a second visual system lurking underneath the cortex alone. Jadi memang pengetahuan kita masih belum jauh pada zaman itu. Ternyata ada second visual system yang menghubungkan visual system yang utama. Karena di sini sudah dijelaskan bahwa yang kehilangannya ada di primary visual cortex bagian belakang. Tapi ada namanya V2, ada V3, dan seterusnya. Begitu. Oke, kita lanjutkan lagi ya. The small hills on the roof. Ini section yang pertama di chapter ketiga. We now know that residual vision is present in persons with a lesion to the primary visual cortex. They might detect the appearance of object, movement, and several other visual properties. Indeed, an entire cottage industry of researchers has vigorously studied vestigial visual function. Let's address this one. Okay, that's also a bit important, as well as visual consciousness. Oh, which part? The last one. Indeed, the entire cottage industry of researchers have rigorously studied vestigial visual function and their application for understanding the brain as well as visual consciousness. Given that persons with remaining vision frequently are unaware of seeing, the reason behind vision abilities are yet to be completely worked out. But much depends on two small hairs in the midbrain at the top of the brainstem. The two structures on the side called supercolliculus, colliculus, where colliculus is more hilarious. Supercolliculus is very close to the area called PAG in figure 2.2. The retina sends light with transforming energy from photons and electric signal that leave the eye through a bundle of cables. Ya, sedikit diberi tanda untuk menjelaskan why people can see a thing even the primary visual cortex is broken. This is a bit here. Okay. As discussed in the chapter second, these cables are made of axons, which convey electrical signals between neurons. Action potentials exciting the eye reach the visual cortex in the back of the brain by way of the thalamus. Interestingly, fibers from the retina project to several other places too, with one group transmitting signals to the superior colliculus at the roof of the midbrain. It is visual processing in this area is partly responsible for the lingering visual capabilities detected in humans with lesion of the primary visual cortex. But humans fail in comparison to the skills played by three sharks. They look like small squirrels' pointy noses. Even with the complete elimination of the primary visual cortex, three sharks exhibit impressive visual behaviors. They avoid obstacles in their path, catch moving pieces of food. Although creatures like mammals have visual areas are cortical, it appears that the balance of contribution to their visual abilities is altered. Human without primary visual cortex are fine, but note some of them demonstrate visual capabilities on careful testing. Patients are far much better in no small part because of the participation of the superior colliculus in their visual behavior. Nah ini dia Ratiusnya punya sedikit perbedaan karena di bagian supercalculus itu masih memiliki fungsi dengan okay. Previously, we discussed how the cortex is comprised of layered shaped of the neurons and the subcortex is poorly structured. In biology, rules always have exceptions to the top part of the brainstem. The superior colliculus is beautifully layered. The number of cell layers varies considerably across species, with some species, such as lizards, having as many as 14 layers. Human and other primates have 7 or so layers. Across vertebrates, the top layers, which are the one who receiving fibers from the retina, are visual and respond to stimuli with short latency responses. In vertebrates that are not mammals, the superior colliculus is called optic tectum because it is clearly visible at the roof of the midbrain, as shown as figure 9.3. Throughout the book, I'll use optic tectum when more clearly referring to non-mammal species. Retinal operation to the superior colliculus topographic, meaning that spatial layout of light hitting the eye, left, right, up, down, and trigger retinal responses is preserved in colliculus. Cells in the colliculus thus form a map of the external visual space, allowing the colliculus to know where objects are in the world. Across vertebrates, the superior colliculus contains immediate, intermediate, and deep layers too. The deep layers, in particular drive action, for instance, have often inputs and a movement of biomass to produce movement signals from the calculus reach regions in the spinal cord, which themselves control head and eye muscles. Combined circuits involving the top and bottom layers also visual inputs to help direct body, head, and eye movement to salient events in the world. Oke, jadi fungsi to produce movement signal from polyglot and cosmogon. Okay, okay. In all, the superior colliculus will receiving visual signal from the retina and by driving muscles accomplishes the essential sensory-motor transformation, whereby sensory stimuli trigger motor responses required to interface with the world. Output input arrangement pretty much necessary for the survival are implemented by the nervous system of the simplest organism and remarkably can be accomplished by even single sensory mode cell per cell. In this case, the cell whose body is embedded in the organism has a receptor end that is sensitive to the external environment and effector that can cause movement in some sort, as simple as some form of contraction. But single-cell solution is rather inflexible, of course. Pretty much every time the receptor can sense something, the effector does is that the solution too costly is to grow more cells in the middle. And that is what nature did when gives a few 100 million years. Indeed, our vertebrates have superior colliculus. Or more generally, a brain. Pressed differently, we can think of the brain with all its different parts as evolution solution to the problem of uncoupling inputs from outputs. Without this flexibility, animals are bound to perish. Oke, saudara kita masukkan ke movement karakteristik penting dan sensori motorik tanpa lewat. Oke, minimal rate. Reseptor soma ini tadi tipnya dasar menjawab kepasan protein dasar pada proses stimulus bebas soma sensori motor dari sensori itu. Okay, next we will go through decision. Oke, kita pembahasan utama ini superior colliculus. Makanya akan kembali ke super simple, jadi pendekatannya dari besar ke kecil. At all times, unequal phase is a crucial three-way decision. Stay the course, move away, or move toward. In rodents, the superior colliculus participates in freezing in place, moving away, and indifference-like behavior. Simulation of the colliculus can produce general arousal pattern, which includes large increases in blood pressure, and heart rate. An analgesia, that is, processes to ameliorate pain, chance produced during natural occurring defensive responses. How is a stimulus classified as harmless, which may or may not be worth investigating further, as opposed to constituting an emergency that requires immediate action? The stimuli position in the visual field plays important roles here. In small rodent, unexpected movement overhead, much like that of predator, more likely triggers flight, whereas movement in the lower field, possibly as prey, more commonly elicit approach. Thus, the superior Regulars could implement a rule much like this. If movement is overhead, flee. Otherwise, if movement is at lower field, consider further exploration. However, simple rules based on elementary stimulus features do not capture the flexibility of rodent behavior. Think how hard is to catch a rat. For one, rest free is more frequently than customary in unfamiliar environments. Like like an open field racing is the name given by researchers to a behavior characterized by the absence of overt activity. Clearly, the context in which a stimulus occurs is paramount. Thus, the sport calculus receive additional information that allows it to contribute to behavior in a more malleable manner. Take the brain of the simple group of presently living vertebrates, lampreys, which are water inhabitants with elongated eel-like bodies and hagfish, sometimes referred to as slime eels. These animals are important to study because they provide clues about characters that were present in the common ancestors to all vertebrates. The optic tectum of the lamprey contains five stacks of neurons. In other vertebrates, superficial layers receive optic fibers, and deep layers send output and contribute to movement. What types of information do the intermediate layer receive? These layers receive input from several sensory resources, including the lateral line system used by some groups of aquatic vertebrates, including fishes, to detect movement and vibration in the surrounding water. The lateral line plays an important role in maintaining the orientation of the body and in schooling behavior and prediction. Notably, in hagfish, optic rectum separation from the hypothalamus, which, as discussed below, participates in a wealth of bodily functions, including food intake, thirst, and sexual behaviors. This is a really game changer, as it allows the superior colliculus not only to listen to multiple cues from the external world, but also receive signal from the internal set of body. Oh, I see. This is important. Supaya kalau kita bisa dapat informasi selain dari stimulus dari dunia luar, ternyata juga bisa menerima stimulus dari yang state of body. For example, our stress level now is the time for procreation, and this is true across all vertebrates, including humans. In this way, the optic tectum outputs have the potential to reflect multiple variables simultaneously, allowing context sensitivity to emerge as a natural consequence of its wiring and processing. The combined information can be used to consider how to react, stay, approach, or withdraw. As stated, as freeze in response to notice family and unfamiliar environment more so than in familiar places. Through intuitive this observation reflects a fundamental principle of brain function context sensitivity. The brain does not simply react to sensory stimuli. Instead, incoming data are incorporated onto ongoing processing that encompasses the states of the brain and the body, explaining why the exact same stimulus. Oke, jadi bagian-bagian super continuous menerima berbagai macam informasi, input, dan output. Except for different effects depending the situation. In one setting, a stimulus might lead to inquisitive approach, in another to moving away. While the general problem of distinguishing an emergency signal from emergency vary markedly between species. This is because adaptive decision must take into account the relative costs and benefits of orienting towards some things and escaping A major benefit of orienting is potential acquiring better information. The eyes may now be directed at the object of interest. Major cost is loss of time. This kind of calculus that paralyzes so much within species. An animal subject to intense predation might have laterally placed eyes that are excellent for panoramic vision, but not for seeing details more centrally. In such a case, the gain of an orienting movement to bring a stimulus onto central vision will be relatively slight, whereas the cost of missing a predator will be high. In some animals, therefore, the balance should be tipped in favor of defensive responding. And this expectation is borne out by our experience with rats, rabbits, squirrels, and deer, for instance. Shoring up defenses. The brain is bathed in colorless fluid also found in spine called cerebrospinal fluid that, among other things, provide buoyancy and protection to the brain. The period aqueductal gray or PAG, classified PAG, is an area immediately adjacent to the superior colliculus. Oke, kalau di bagian dua ini banyak sekali section yang kedua ini banyak sekali input yang nantinya akan bisa digunakan untuk menentukan pilihan-pilihan mana, apakah kalau untuk hewan sederhananya apakah saya curious, pengen tahu, atau aku langsung takut pergi, atau mungkin freezing gitu. Jadi bagian section 2 lebih ke sana. Sekarang lari ke bagian section 3. The channel contains cerebrospinal hence the name Zunzu. Although I have abbreviation throughout the book, the name Pere Aqueductal Central is too unwieldy, a bit hard to pronounce actually. The PAG is where a pulse from the superior collicus and many other regions can be processed into more full or defensive programs. In several ways, the PAG can be viewed as an extension of deep layers of the superior collicus. Unlike the cortex and superior colliculus, the PAG doesn't have layers. It has to be addressed. However, the region is not an amorphous spec of cells and seem to be organized based on columns aligned parallel to a long axis of brainstem. At least two columns of cells have alternate divisory behavior. In a rat or a cat, excitation of neurons, the active column generates behavior such as facing and backing away or full-blown flight reaction. And this, a very small to natural action, sees when animal is threatened or attacked. Excitation of neurons in the passive column generates an entirely different response, namely the necessitation of ongoing activity and profound hyporeactivity with the animal neither orienting nor responding to its environment. This type of raising behavior is rather similar to that of an animal that has incurred an injury or after defeat in social encounter, say being chased by a large animal. Notably, Beijing generates coordinated action, that is to say, not simply acceleration reaction, like knee jerk reflex, but full-blown behaviors. So, when engaged with superior calculus, the Beijing can assist in production defensive action that are beneficial at point of time. Yeah. Seeking of rewards. Jadi kalau di sini penjelasannya adalah kalau ada bagian yang lebih fokus pada defensive action yang di sini dinamakan PS. Kalau dari posisi yang awal tadi, yang bagian calculus, itu lebih ke banyak ada penimbangan begitu. Namun kalau dari beberapa sejauh yang saya baca, sepertinya section yang ketiga, chapter yang ketiga ini lebih ke arah bukan bagaimana dari result yang sederhana, otak yang paling sederhana seperti yang Anda tahu, nervous system tepatnya, tetapi lebih ke arah, oh ternyata ketika melaksanakan sesuatu, belum tentu kita membutuhkan semua bagian otak untuk bisa dijalankan. Gitu. Jadi kita bisa saja hanya menjelaskan pada beberapa bagian saja. Contohnya kalau di sini ketika ada lesion, ada beberapa waktu ada kan ada bagian perakalnya ternyata rusak, ternyata masih punya sense dalam tanda kutip untuk menilai lingkungan. Oke, lanjutnya. Survival is as much about getting out of the way of danger as it is about the keeping the body, being food and species things sex. Like when should an animal approach something, interestingly, the page is not about defense but participates in adaptive behavior too. Oh, this is new to me. Di sebelumnya, fokusnya adalah defensive behavior. Di bagian sini, behavior nggak hanya tentang defensive action, tapi juga ada appetitive behavior atau keinginan, appetite gitu. That is, those behaviors that increase the likelihood of satisfying specific needs. Sex, for one, is tricky business. Not all some species hierarchical, with the alpha of the pack having mating privileges, but many cases, females are only receptive during specific periods. Navigate the system poorly and you could end up badly injured. Lordosis behavior, also called presenting, is body posture often by many mammals, including rodents, felines, and elephants, that indicates female receptivity to copulation. The body position during lordosis is often crucial to reproduction, as it elevates the hip, thereby facilitating penetration by the penis. Lordosis is commonly seen in female mammals during eclipse. Interestingly, the page refers to lordosis behavior as suggested by impairments in this type of behavior when the structure is resumed. The midbrain, where the superior colliculus and the PAG are located, contains other structures that are quite important for appetitive behavior. A region called the substantia nigra, so named because it appears darker than neighboring areas in chemical preparations, has received a great deal of attention. The supercolliculus has direct connection to the substantia nigra, and importantly, can cause rapid visual activation of neurons there. The reason the pathway from superior colliculus to the substantia nigra is particularly noteworthy is that the latter synthesize and uses the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine by itself plays a significant role in the function of the striatum. The dopaminergic processing, that is, another mechanism that also uses dopamine as a key neurotransmitter for neuronal signaling communication, is important during the processing of novel or salient stimuli. Dopamine has received enormous attention because of its involvement during reward processing, including approaching objects previously associated with, like food. Thus, the pathway from the supracolliculus to the substantia nigra allows the former to participate in appetitive action rather directly. This is especially the case given extensive connection from the substantia nigra to the striatum and participation in motivated behavior. Pada saat itu might be effortful and move along this path and bring me closer obtaining what I want. Ya, di sini dikenalkan ada bagian otak yang baru namanya substantia nigra. Lebih tepatnya di sini ketika dia kerjasama dengan superior colliculus dan PAP, maka dia punya tendensi untuk mengeluarkan dopamin, ya, menggunakan dopamin. Nah, dopamin ini punya significant role untuk apa namanya mendapatkan reward. Oke, neurotransmitter shock detour. The neurons communicate with one another through chemicals released at their synaptic contacts. Several classes of neurotransmitters have been uncovered, each of which lead to a maze of neurochemical complexity. A peculiarity of several neurotransmitters is that they are synthesized in only a handful of areas. Yet they punch way above their weight because the areas that produce them reach large swaths of the brain through their extensive anatomical connections. What we call projections system. The clearest example is norepinephrine. It's to pronounce, which is contained in only a few small collection of cells, body in the brainstem. Remarkably, anatomical pathways from these sites go almost everywhere, including cortically and subcortically, enabling this molecule to influence cellular signaling throughout the brain. Dopamine, too, is manufactured in only a few areas, one of which is the substantia nigra. The dopamine contaminates cells that project the basal ganglia in the system. Substantia nigra plus basal ganglia has been extensively studied because it is a root of Parkinson's disease. In the people affected, the dopaminergic neurons in the slightly nigra die, causing the symptoms of disease, most notably tremors, reverted movement, difficulty standing, and initial movement such as walking. Fortunately, the motor impairment can be greatly ameliorated with the administration of L-DOPA, a chemical precursor to dopamine that increase its concentration in the brain. Jadi ketika ada apa ya masalah dalam bagian otak yang ini sebenarnya nigra itu kebanyakan akan led ya menuju Parkinson disease ini menjadi kita sih. In the early 1980s, the idea that dopamine is important for motivation as linked to reward and reinforcement took shape. And since then, a tremendous volume of help has shown ways in which this molecule is involved in these processes. How dopamine, how dopamine-related mechanisms are altered in addiction is a question that is actively researched. Most drugs that lead to addiction, including psychostimulants like amphetamine, increase levels of dopamine in the striatum, which can be verified by using an imaging method called positron emission tomography that use small amounts of radioactive drugs that detect specific chemicals in the brain. Studies using this technique to show that the participants will display the greatest increase of dopamine after taking drugs are also the ones who were the most intense high of feeling the euphoria. Okay. It is not surprising, therefore, that dopamine is at times treated like the reward molecule. This infelicitous expression is common in general media and non-specialty books. Unfortunately, it is also how some researchers speak. I also demand. I need to revise myself. I need to assess myself before my understanding message. But there is no such as thing as a reward molecule. The message is not in the molecule. A particular neurotransmitter is involved in multiple functions and its effect will vary based on the pre-region and circuit where it operates, including the behavioral context in the equation. For one, dopamine in the striatum is not exclusively related to motivation positive events. That processing of negative stimuli involves this molecule too. Thus, dopamine is not a reward molecule for the same reason we would call it a movement molecule. Given the motoric impairment seen in Parkinson patients, this tendency to associate one neurotransmitter with one function is conceptual shortcoming that impedes progress. Consider the involvement of dopamine in the devastating mental disorder of schizophrenia. In 1949, a French surgeon observed the chemical created as a new type of color dye in the 19th century and markedly calming effect of some surgical patients. This is exactly how they decide to administer chemical dye situation. It is quite perplexing. Soon after, the latter dye was found to have beneficial effects on schizophrenics. And in 1960, it was approved in the USA that treatment for this condition, chemical chlorpromazine, doesn't cause schizophrenia but can attenuate the most severe so-called positive system. There's a false belief like the thought that one behavior being closely recorded and disordered stuff. Okay. The success of chlorpromazine and thermoeffective drug like Harplan led research to the determine theory of schizophrenia. Drugs that have repetitiveness antagonize dopamine action. According to this framework, dopaminergic reaction from the midbrain to the cortex and spinal structure is overactivated in schizophrenia, dumping too much of this neurotransmitter in the recipient territories. Although current understanding of the role of dopamine in this mental disorder is considerably more nuanced, we can draw the following point from the basic dopamine theory. Schizophrenia is not caused by dopamine but by dysregulation of multiple circuits containing dopamine in rather complex way. Oke, jadi tidak semudah itu kembali. Kita tidak boleh dalam neuroscience untuk menentukan bahwa ini penyebab ini, tetapi lebih baik menggunakan kalimat bahwa semuanya itu masalahnya tidak sederhana itu. Masih ada hal yang lain. Contohnya adalah bukan karena dopamin, gangguan skizofrenia itu, tetapi karena dysregulation of multiple circuit containing dopamine yang bisa jadi lebih kompleks lagi daripada dysregulasi tidak sinkronnya sirkuit dalam yang berhubungan dengan. Oke, selanjutnya internal konteks sinyal MINC. Processing whisper calculus benefit from signal that convey the organism can state shape and structure to provide this information is hypothalamus. As the name implies, the hypothalamus circulates below thalamus, so that means well not very imaginative here. There's also just above the brainstem. By the first of 900, the hypothalamus was identified as an anomaly into the surrounding the third ventricle. Ventricles are cavities in the brain that are filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. In 1904, Hall encountered in chapter 2 describes several clear formation methods of neuron forming the hypothalamus. In 1929, Harvey Cushing, considered by many to be the father of modern neurosurgery, described the function of the hypothalamus in this way. Here in this well-concealed spot, almost to be covered with a thumbnail, lies the very mainspring of primitive existence, negative, emotional, reproductive. Since 1920 and 1928, 1930s, Arnold's hypothalamic function has greatly expanded. Current understanding concurs with their earlier notion that the area is involved in multiple facets, life-preserving operations, including complex homeostatic mechanism, in addition to contributing to the neuroendocrine outputs. The endocrine system involves a network of glands that produce and release hormones that regulate many body functions. As we'll cover in chapter 5, the hypothalamus participates during an array of processes having to do with wakefulness, sleep, hangovers, and defensive behavior, among others. Ini akan dibahas kembali di fungsi dari hipotalamus ya. By receiving signal for hypothalamus, supercalculus is private to a high signal to internal condition of the organism. Sensory inputs can then lead to motor action in a way that appropriate for the animal state. Is it injured, hungry, or sleepy? Jadi hipotalamus itu sebagai regulator untuk memberikan informasi kepada superior colliculus apakah suhunya berapa nih badan. Kalau kedinginan berarti nanti efeknya wah nanti orang ini kedinginan. Akan menunjukkan motor sistemnya, mata berusaha mencari di mana selimut, kemudian tangan mengambilnya, kaki bergerak menuju selimut tadi. Jadi itu konsep sederhana. Extending the circuit, we started the superior colliculus, which receive retinal inputs and can guide movement to in a fairly direct way. Some of connections movement extend down to the spinal cord and from there can influence muscle movement by way of a single addition connection. We then add the PAG, which help generate defensive and appetitive behavior. We consider sebenarnya, which is particularly important for appetitive behavior in manner that is especially spent when we compare that the striatum to show hypothalamus considerable degree of context dependency on to the system. Rangkuman dari section 3 yang ada di sini. Put together, the species constitute a sort of minimal brain with cerebral motor output and part of in-between. Remember that the in-between is how inputs and outputs critical. No one likes to repeat the same thing over and over. Nature will eliminate anything that does. The phrase really helped the animal as for the critical stay operational. It has to orchestrate approach and withdrawal action while the animal navigation is environment. The combined circuit supports an extended behavioral repertoire and frees the animal from responding in the same way every time it receives a specific input. The mini brain in the midbrain and neighboring structures like the hypothalamus and striatum allow us to start navigating the central nervous system and considering how sounds will contribute to behavior. To what extent is this exercise of carving out a part of the brain reasonable? Can we separate mini brain from the rest? Do we need to consider additional pathways and regions to understand how the mini brain contributes to behavioral functions? Perhaps the superior colliculus or article, a key region of this circuit, is sufficiently isolated that cell strategy could work particularly in simple animals. As briefly as is possibly for the discussion, see chapter 9. In fishes, amphibians, and reptiles, the optic tectum is enormous and wield immense influences. Information processing in these vertebrates heavily include this area, and its large number of input-output pathways precludes isolating it from the rest of the brain in an attempt to understand its function. Mammals have a forebrain that is rather prominent, including its layer mantle, the cortex. Perhaps in this case, the superior colliculus are more isolated and thus a better example of a mini brain. Au contraire, The mammalian superorganisms is abundantly interconnected with the remainder of the central nervous system, so much so that one elder eventually stated God has support to define self. Article, according to the author's logic, the self should be located somewhere in the brain that is very well connected anomically. Hmm, okay, sulit mendefinisikan self. This exercise of isolating brain regions, outlining how they contribute to behavioral function, while useful didactically, is rather unsatisfactory. To some extent, we will continue to resort to it if only because reading understanding proceed in sequential manner. But the reader should remember that we can simply point to the present and say that this behavior resides there. Instead, central to this book is that anomically distributed circuit bring about the behavior in question. This is should be underlined. Even distributed circuit need to be absolutely behaving animal in mass in broader context. Bearing this in mind, Uh, potential strategy to appreciate how brain regions contribute to functions and behavior is considered the allocation of interest and gradual expanding circle of areas to which is connected. This question is that how does this region that we care about have varied mechanism of interest in combination with other regions? If we're able to tackle this problem more directly, we have to pull off vocabulary folder and familiarize ourselves with many cortical and subcortical allies that have been implicated in domains that a standardized textbooks would classify as perception, cognition, and emotion, and so on. In fact, even before we do that, we need to delve deeper into an issue neuroscientists are faced with front and center. How should we think the individual areas of the brain and their contribution to behavior? I think this is the last one, chapter 3. Oke, jadi bagian terakhir itu tentang merangkum semua bagian hal di sana. Tapi ini tidak seperti yang saya bayangkan sebelumnya bahwa mulai dari evolusi ini lebih ke bagaimana fungsi ya, kelakuan itu dimunculkan dari beberapa sirkuit. Sirkuit di sini maksudnya adalah hubungan antara bagian-bagian organ otak. Itu kalau dalam contoh di sini dia menggunakan apa sih tadi? Subcortical collicus, ya kalau nggak salah. Iya, subcortical collicus. Superior collicus. Collicus, branches, striatum. Ini adalah sirkuit. Begitu. Nah, yang terakhir ini mempertanyakan kembali kepada kita karena beberapa penjelasan pada session ini lebih mengutamakan sedikit tentang localization atau modularity. Jadi apa ya, meskipun beliau penulis sendiri kurang terlalu setuju dengan hal ini, lebih ke arah kompleks proses. Tapi ini juga tidak terlalu jauh daripada kompleks brain system entangled brain tadi. Nah, memang lebih tepatnya tidak mudah untuk mendefinisikan behavior dan apa saja yang berkontribusi terhadap behavior. Oke, itu dulu untuk bagian ketiga, buku ketiga dari buku The Entangled Brain from Luiz Pessoa. Oke, terima kasih. Semoga bermanfaat kalian. And bye.